Soldiers of the realm, the enemy lies within those walls. Tonight we fight for victory and glory.
In the late 13th century, deep within the forests near Canterbury, England was preparing for war. But while kings raised armies, a secret coven of witches had a darker plan. Hidden beneath an abandoned stone chapel, 5 witches gathered every night around a circle of black candles. Their goal was forbidden: to create supernatural soldiers that could never die. Using dark magic, ancient runes, and blood rituals, they began experimenting on captured prisoners from nearby villages. The witches believed they could turn ordinary men into immortal warriors who would fight for them. For weeks, nothing happened. Until one stormy night, the ritual finally worked. Or so they thought. The man on the stone altar opened his eyes, but they were no longer human. They were black and hungry. Before the witches could react, the creature tore free from its chains. It didn't obey them, it attacked them. By morning, the chapel was covered in blood, and the thing they created had vanished into the forest. Within days, villagers began reporting something terrifying. People were being found drained of blood. The witches hadn't created soldiers, they had created the first vampires, and the nightmare had only just begun. A week after the ritual, the villages outside Canterbury began whispering about something moving through the forest at night. At first, it was only livestock. Sheep were found torn apart in the fields. Then, travelers began disappearing along the road between villages. One night, a miller returning home heard something following him through the trees. He ran, but the thing in the forest was faster. The next morning, the villagers found his body beside the road, pale, cold, and completely drained of blood. Soon, the attacks grew worse. The creature no longer hid in the forest. It began entering the village at night. Doors were found open, windows shattered. More bodies appeared with the same 2 marks on their necks. But the most terrifying discovery came days later. A young farmer who had been buried after an attack was seen walking near the graveyard after midnight. His eyes were dark, his skin pale, and when villagers approached him, he smiled, revealing sharp fangs. The witches realized something horrifying. The creature they created wasn't just killing people, it was turning them. The first vampire had begun making more, and the village was about to become their hunting ground. The king didn't send soldiers. He sent men who hunt things that shouldn't exist. When the bodies began piling up outside Canterbury, the rumors finally reached the royal court. Villagers spoke of pale figures walking after midnight and graves that never stayed closed. At first, the king dismissed it as peasant superstition, until a royal messenger arrived carrying something wrapped in cloth. Inside were 3 wooden crosses ripped from freshly disturbed graves. That night, the king gave an order he had not given in 20 years. He summoned the Black Hunters. They were not knights. They were trackers, trained to kill creatures the church refused to name. Within days, 5 hunters rode toward the cursed village. Each carried strange weapons: silver blades, iron stakes, bottles of blessed oil. But when they reached the forest outside the village, something felt wrong. The woods were silent. No birds, no wind. Then one hunter looked toward the hill above the village. 3 pale figures were standing there, perfectly still in the moonlight, watching them, waiting. And that's when the hunters realized something terrifying. The vampires were no longer hiding, they were gathering. The hunters expected to find one monster, but what they found beneath the chapel was far worse. The 5 black hunters followed the tracks deep into the forest outside Canterbury. Broken branches, claw marks in the soil, and something darker. drops of blood that looked far too fresh. The trail led them to a ruined stone chapel, forgotten by time. Its doors were torn open. The air inside was cold and silent. One hunter lit a torch and stepped down into the chapel cellar. At first, it looked like an ordinary crypt, but then the light revealed something horrifying. Rows of coffins, dozens of them, each one made from freshly stolen grave wood. One hunter slowly opened the nearest coffin. Inside lay a corpse, pale and motionless. Then suddenly, its eyes snapped open, the torches went out, and from every coffin in the cellar, the vampires began to rise. Claws scraping wood, bones cracking back to life. The hunters drew their silver glades as shadows surrounded, but in the chaos, one hunter was dragged screaming into the darkness. When the others finally escaped the chapel, they were no longer 5, they were 4, and behind them in the crypt, their captured companion was already beginning to change. The hunters thought they had found the monsters until a witch stepped out of the forest and said something far worse. Only 4 hunters remained after the chapel encounter that night. They rode through the forest without stopping, the screams of their captured companions still echoing in their minds. But before dawn, their horses suddenly stopped. Something was standing in the middle of the road. A woman, dressed in a dark cloak, her pale hands covered in strange black markings. One of the hunters raised his sword. Another vampire? The woman slowly shook her head. I am the one who created them. The hunters froze. She was a witch, one of the same witches who had performed the cursed experiment. I tried to stop it, she said quietly. The ritual was meant to create warriors, but something ancient answered our magic instead. She looked toward the distant hills surrounding the village near Canterbury. They are not just feeding, she whispered. They are evolving. The hunters demanded answers, but the witch only said one thing before disappearing back into the fog. The first one we created is no longer just a vampire. And somewhere, deep inside the ruined chapel, something much older than the others slowly opened its eyes. The witch said the forest was changing, but the hunters didn't understand how bad it had become. After the witch vanished into the fog, the 4 remaining hunters rode deeper into the forest surrounding Canterbury. At first, everything seemed normal, but then they noticed something strange. There were no animal sounds, no birds, no insects. Even the wind had stopped moving through the trees. The forest felt dead. One hunter dismounted and examined the ground. Fresh tracks, dozens of them. Bare human footprints leading deeper into the woods. But something about them was wrong. The footprints suddenly stopped, as if the creatures had simply vanished into the air. Then one hunter looked up, and his blood turned cold. Pale figures were clinging to the trees above them, watching, silent. Dozens of glowing eyes staring down through the branches. The vampires had learned something new. They were no longer hiding in graves. They were hunting in packs. The hunters raised their torches and backed away slowly. But deep in the darkness of the forest, something much larger moved. Not like the others, stronger, faster, smarter. The first vampire was evolving, and it was already watching them. The hunters thought the forest was the worst place to fight them until the vampires came for the village. The hunters escaped the cursed forest just before dawn. Behind them, the glowing eyes in the trees slowly disappeared back into the darkness. But they knew one thing now. The vampires were no longer hiding. They were organizing. That night, the hunters reached the village outside Canterbury and warned everyone to stay inside. Doors were barred, windows sealed, torches lit across the streets. For hours, nothing happened.
Then the dogs started barking. One hunter stepped into the road and looked toward the forest. At first, he saw nothing. Then shapes began moving through the fog. Dozens of pale figures slowly walking toward the village, eyes glowing, claws ready. The vampires had come together, not to hunt quietly anymore, but to take the entire village. The hunters raised their silver swords, while villagers hid inside their homes. Torches flickered in the wind, and then the first vampire attack began. Screams echoed through the night as creatures leapt from rooftops and shadows. The hunters fought desperately, cutting down several vampires, but for every one they killed, 2 more appeared from the fog. Then suddenly, the battle stopped. Every vampire turned toward the same direction, toward the hill above the village. A tall figure stepped forward from the darkness, pale, ancient, eyes glowing like fire. The first vampire had arrived, and the siege had only just begun.
The hunters thought they were fighting monsters, but the creature on the hill was something far worse. The entire battlefield went silent. Every vampire stopped attacking. They all turned toward the hill above the village near Canterbury, and then the hunters saw him. A tall figure slowly stepped out of the fog. His skin was pale like death. His eyes burned red in the darkness. Unlike the others, he wasn't moving like an animal. He walked slowly, calmly, like a king returning to his throne. The other vampires bowed their heads as he passed. One hunter whispered in fear, "That must be the first one." The creature stopped at the edge of the hill and looked down at the village. Then something terrifying happened. He spoke. His voice was cold and ancient. "You were never meant to survive the ritual." The hunters froze because vampires were never supposed to speak, but this one could. He lifted his hand slowly, and every vampire in the village suddenly turned toward the hunters, waiting for a command. The first vampire smiled, revealing long fangs. Then he whispered one word, "Kill," and the entire vampire army rushed forward.
The witch said there was one way to stop him, but it required something the hunters were not ready to give. The hunters were losing. Steel and fire meant nothing against an army that did not fear death. Under the command of the first vampire, the creatures moved like one mind, precise, relentless, unstoppable. As the battle raged through the village near Canterbury, one of the hunters remembered the witch's warning. "There is only one way to end this," he shouted for the others to fall back. Through burning streets and broken homes, the surviving hunters fought their way to the old chapel, the same place where the nest had been discovered. Inside, hidden beneath the stone floor, they found it. A ritual circle carved into the ground, ancient symbols burned into the stone. Dark magic, the same magic that created the first vampire. One hunter hesitated because he understood what it meant. This ritual, it doesn't destroy them. The others turned to him. It binds them, and it needs blood, living blood. Before they could decide, the chapel doors exploded open. The first vampire had arrived. He stepped inside slowly, his glowing eyes scanning the room, almost amused. "You still believe you can undo what you created?" he said. The hunters raised their weapons, but none of them moved, because deep down, they knew the truth. To stop the Vampire King, one of them would have to sacrifice everything.
To stop the first vampire, one of them had to become something worse. The ritual circle began to glow. The symbols carved into the stone burned with dark energy. The hunters stood in silence inside the chapel near Canterbury. They all knew what had to be done, but none of them moved. Then one hunter stepped forward, the youngest, his hands shaking. but his eyes steady. If this ends it, then it has to be me. The others tried to stop him, but he stepped into the center of the ritual circle and drew his blade. The first vampire watched from the shadows, smiling. "Do you really believe sacrifice will save you?" he said. The hunter ignored him. He cut his palm and let the blood fall onto the ancient symbols. At first, nothing happened. Then, the circle ignited. Dark light surged through the chapel. The ground trembled, and the hunter screamed. His body lifted from the ground as the magic took hold. The vampires outside began to shriek. Some collapsed. Others turned toward the chapel in panic. The first vampire's expression changed for the first time. Not fear, but anger. The ritual was working, but something was wrong. The hunter's body began to change. His eyes glowed brighter than any vampire. His veins darkened. His voice echoed unnaturally as he spoke. "I can feel them." The ritual hadn't destroyed the curse, it had transferred it. The hunter slowly turned toward the first vampire. No longer human, no longer controlled. Something new, something worse. The first vampire stepped back just once. For the first time, he was not in control.